So welcome to everyone listening now and in the future. This is one of our free lecture series with experts in the pre and perinatal healing online school. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate White. I'm the director of the school and a host for you today. And it's a free lecture with Jim Feil. It's called 3 Levels of Somatic Storytelling, Understanding and Managing Our Personal Stories for New Growth. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Feil to you if you have not met Jim. I personally, he's one of my favorite people to learn from, and extraordinarily gifted teacher and practitioner, which I hope that you'll get a sense of today. Dr. Jim Feil has over 45 years in the study, practice, and teaching of energetic and somatic therapeutic practices. His first career was as a teacher of English and American literature. Oop. I'm going to ask you to mute if you have it muted. Thank you. He began his career in therapy by studying with the founder of polarity therapy, Dr. Randolph Stone, in 1970, and went on to earn his Doctor of Chiropractic degree in California in 1986. He began studying formative psychology with Stanley Kellerman in 1981, continuing until his passing in 2018. He has studied and taught craniosacral biodynamics with Franklin Sills and pre- and perinatal therapy, among other methodologies. He works with adults using verbal and body-oriented techniques, specializing in formative and somatic methodologies. He has taught in the U.S., throughout Europe, and in China. His work directs itself at helping individuals form themselves to effectively and competently respond to life transitions, challenges, crises, and opportunities. So please go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Wow. Great, Kate. Okay, I accept. Good. So today we got an hour to take a look at what is a really huge topic. I mean, we all know storytelling is a massive territory. So I'm going to be doing a little cherry picking, selecting out hopefully some ideas that might be of interest to you. I know many of you are quite experienced with listening to stories in different ways, clients and in many settings. But hopefully the way we go about opening up the topic a bit will be useful for you. So here goes. I'm going to kind of just step in. Hopefully towards the end of the hour, we'll have time for a very short demo so that you can see a little bit about the methodology that we're talking about. I know some of you have quite a bit of exposure to it already, but for a lot of you, I assume it's pretty new. So the simple entry is that to stories is that something happens in our lives and we package it in stories, out of our own experience. So to a certain extent, a story is a packaging of our experience. Yeah. And we all know stories are constructed, they're constructed, they're invented, and they're selected out of a huge matrix of possibilities. Yeah. So it's interesting that, people are so intent on convincing us of their story, of their narrative, when of course it's really, it's an invented process. Maybe it resonates with us. But I think we should never forget that it's constructed, out of material that is both general and very personal. Yeah. So stories really are what we would call an intimate ground. No matter what story you're telling, there's a way in which it really is intimate ground, in the sense, even if whether you're being honest, sincere, or you're manipulating the story to provide a certain image or a mask of yourself, you're always revealing yourself through your stories. Yeah, there's no way you can't. No matter how good you are at acting, the stories will reveal themselves. Of course, people need to know in a way how to listen, and and what to listen for. And depending on how you listen, it is quite amazing what information you can glean. So whenever we tell stories, I think it's good to appreciate that. First, we have constructed something. And second, we are letting ourselves be seen, no matter how carefully we're trying to construct it. So as we said, we're going to take a brief look at stories that we tell ourselves consciously. And then, of course, there are all these stories that we tell ourselves and we're not aware of them. Those are more complicated. And then the process of telling other stories, is very situational. And so you can tell the same basic story to different people, and it comes out quite differently. Yeah. So all three of these stories are entangled, right? The two stories to ourselves and the stories to others are entangled in so many ways, right? And we may be talking about topics that are of interest to others, and yet all of that ties into our own personal internal world, right? Our memories, our own survival instincts, our emotions, our needs. And so everything by nature is powerfully entangled. That doesn't mean that it can't have a certain coherence, it can't have a certain clarity. But it's a complex process, and the stories obviously show up in our behaviors, in our actions. And that's a lot of what we focus on in our type of listening. Yeah. And these stories are told somehow to help us manage our experience and to form ourselves. Yeah. And so that's critical, right? Everybody's talking about self-regulation, and not so much about self-forming, and they really go together. So the procedure we'll look at in a little bit is what's called, and it's built around Stanley Kellerman's 5-step procedure. He also calls it his bodying practice. It's an incredibly simple and elegant process that one can begin to use in a very simple way with sometimes very surprising results. And then from there, you can build a wonderfully elegant and much more sophisticated way of listening. Yeah. So obviously in these kinds of talks with as many of you as there are, I can't stop to see how you're doing with it. I'm just going to assume that you can follow me and that I've got a rhythm that's adequate for you, and that I'm not hopefully losing you. So the work, this 5-step process encourages, in Kellerman's words, encourages a somatic self-knowing. Yeah. And, and we know we live in a world of somatic, orientation, somatic therapies, and they all have their way into this somatic process, but basically he emphasizes it's a somatic self-knowing. And this 5-step body practice procedure, is a way to clarify our stories and to differentiate their layers, which is so important because we are always trying to figure our way through our lives, sometimes more intensely than others. Sometimes we actually seem to have a handle on things. What a relief. And so often in our relationships, in our work, and in so many ways, we really are working through a certain fog. And so this process, the process of how we clarify our stories, how we begin the process of disentanglement is really important. And not to complicate it, but it very much ties into how we form our adult. Our stories are also at a very deep level interested in forming our adult. Yeah, all of us probably listening here are adults at a certain level and a certain maturity. And yet somehow the adult building process is a long process. But anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Okay, I'm taking a breath. Encouraging you to use breath. Somebody turned on their somebody turned off their muting so I can hear myself. Okay. So in terms of stories, right, this intimate ground that we're talking about. Now, Karen Horney was a great psychoanalyst. Some of you may know her work. She was a Freud disciple and then kind of went her own way. And I'm paraphrasing her a little bit for my end, but basically she says, humans have three great stories. These are the critical stories that shape us and interest us. So there are stories about looking for connection, looking for love, looking for belonging. So there's a whole world of stories, whether we're aware of it or not. Those stories for some people are urgent, are their ground, somehow looking for connection in different ways, belonging, and eventually being included in a way that we can call love. Yeah. A second group of stories are stories where we're looking for a freedom, right? We're looking for, a kind of detaching ourselves from being too embedded in families or too embedded in the world, where we need to individuate. We need, in a way, to separate, to find a certain autonomy. Yeah. And so these are a whole range of stories where we're engaging freedom, somehow that deep sense of being free, not necessarily, not in an adolescent freedom, but in a sense of freedom that has a more adult quality, and where we can make our own decisions and go our own ways. And even if we're aware of the social world we're in, we still have this sense of freedom to make choices. And then the third type of stories are the stories where we're looking for empowerment, the ability to be competent, the ability to shape things ourselves and our environment. Yeah. And so anyway, she goes into these obviously very extensively, but I think these three great stories of connection and love, freedom, and empowerment shape so much of even the small stories that we begin to engage ourselves and other people with, both the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell others. Okay. Another topic, of course, relevant to stories is the styles of story listening, right? Different therapeutic methodologies, or any type of person to person work develops a certain listening style. And a listening style, it might be built around certain guidelines or principles that the therapy or the methodology is interested in. But our listening styles are also personal. In a way, I listen in the way I listen, and somebody else will listen in the way they listen. But of course, we understand that the listening style invites the story, right? And different listening styles and different values will invite a slightly different story, because a storyteller is also looking for cues. They're not just spewing it out. It's a powerfully social interaction. And so, it's a kind of what's called a co-bodying, right? And so that's why it's so important to really look carefully at our listening style and the kinds of cues we give, and and the way we step into the person, the way we step out. So listening styles are a critical piece that we need to examine and ripen in ourselves. Yeah. And most listening styles or listening modalities, they listen first of all for content, right? What are the events that the person is talking about? What are the situations they're talking about? Yeah. So there's what's the particular history that the person is talking about? So this is all content based. Yeah. And a lot of methodologies focus primarily on the content, but they also might focus also on the emotional experience, right? What emotional, content is generated by this story? What is the person dealing with? Is it anger or shame or terror, or any one of a number of grief, any one of a number of powerful emotional states and emotional responses to what's going on, including sensations, feelings, memories. So this is also another dimension of listening, how I listen to the emotional tones. And of course, some people actually, whether they want to or not, get a little bit activated. Listeners can get activated by certain kinds of emotional states in the speaker. So those are all things we need to pay attention to, right? So content, emotional experience. And of course, as we're listening to these stories, the stories are telling us about people's dilemmas, about their conflicts, about their crises, about their double binds, about their challenges, about their defeats, about their victories. Yeah. This is also a kind of content, but it's a content that really focuses the story, what it's about. Yeah. And of course, when we listen to a lot of stories, we also appreciate how the person starts telling us one story, which they think is the critical story. And as we listen and as they listen to themselves and we interact, that story can change radically. And you find out that there was a story below the story that actually is what needs to be, in a way, heard and explored. Yeah. So stories have sequences, they have stages, they have transitions, they link up to other stories. It's a whole world, yeah. And as a story listener, I need to appreciate that. I need to appreciate when a story takes a shift, makes a transition, right? And the logic of that, what kind of, not necessarily a mental logic, emotional logic, associational logic, yeah. So all of these dimensions, that's what makes it interesting. It's such a rich field, but it's a complex field. And sometimes people, in their therapies will try to shrink the field to make it manageable so that they can intervene and have what they feel like is a useful effect. And yet I think part of what we listen to in stories is to listen with an ever larger overview, with an ever larger field of receptiveness and listening, so that we don't over-contain the story. I've seen a lot of therapists and people kind of a bit over-contain the story. Like I say, partly so that they can have a role in it, but also because it can get very big. And how do we ourselves expand our listening field so that we don't jump to judgment, jump to conclusions, and allow a story to sometimes take very unusual directions? And all of this is part of the art of listening. Yeah. A story actually is the forward-looking movement of a person's life. We tell stories because we're trying to move forward in our lives. Either we're establishing a direction or we're dealing with obstacles to our forward movement. And a lot of people come to therapy because somehow the forward movement of their lives, it's just not happening in a way that's satisfying or effective. Yeah. And so to appreciate this dialogue, this self-dialogue of what's trying to move forward, what's trying to evolve, what's trying to grow, and what's really holding back, what are the issues? Yeah. And that's a very primary conversation, which I'm sure many of you engage in, right? That conversation of where is my story trying to take me, right? And what blocks that movement? Yeah. And so, ultimately, in the formative vision, and Kellerman has stated, and I kind of concur, that our great desire is to be the most fully functional adult that we can be. That's the ripe fruit. There's something in us, and we can, it's a very interesting exploration. But just like, an apple tree wants to create a ripe apple, a grapevine wants to create ripe, sweet, juicy, plump grapes. The human seed wants to develop a fully functioning adult in not just in a social context, but in their sense of being able to manage and live effectively in a complex world. Yeah. And I think that's a very nice image of what moves us forward, what keeps us evolving. Yeah. And of course, we have to deal with traumatic and other kinds of events that interrupt the momentum of growing our adult. Yeah. If we were in a regular class, I'd ask everybody how you're doing, but I'm just going to have to assume you're doing okay, right? In this context, and I will just make that assumption. Hopefully it's okay for you. There will be a little time for questions and so forth if they're coming up. So so we've talked a little bit of our conscious stories. Our unconscious stories, of course, that's the biggie, right? Or one of the biggies. Our unconscious stories are hard to access. We don't even really know their shape. We don't really know they're there. Well, we know they're there because Freud, among others, told us. Yeah. And so we kind of know they're there. We have shadows. We have all kinds of early family history. We have a large unconscious that is shaping us. And how do we get access? And Freud, of course, he said, the royal road to the unconscious are dreams. And of course, within traditional psychoanalysis, you have free association. You have a whole series of initial strategies to access this potent and powerful and large unconscious. And of course, the field of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has continued to grow and continued to develop ways to begin to access and begin to process and manage that profound unconscious. The formative work has its way, which I think is incredibly elegant and works a lot with the enacting of our stories, the motor dimension, which has a huge amount of information about the unconscious organization of us. And Kellerman, that's one of Kellerman's primary interests. And so anyway, if we have a little chance at the end, we'll do a very short demo. Hard to get a clear idea in 1 hour of what this is all about, but hopefully this is communicating with you. But for example, if we're really looking at the shape of our stories, do the stories we tell ourselves and others, for example, just simply, do they make us bigger than we are, or attempt to make us bigger, inflate us, or they make us smaller than we actually are, right? You listen to stories and you see that all the time. We make ourselves bigger, we make ourselves smaller, and to a great extent because we really don't know what our true size is. A lot of people don't have that reference. What's my real size? We have child layers in us. We have future adult layers calling us. We have quite an interesting mishmash here, right? And so when you listen to stories, are these stories about trying to be bigger or being smaller? A lot of stories are about, closeness and distance. How do I overcome distance to make contact and connection, right? Or if I'm too embedded, I'm too merged, I'm too fused, I'm too needy. How do my stories help me separate, get some distance, get a little bit of autonomy, right? Or how do my stories, shared and otherwise, sustain me in myself? How do I develop a moderately stable sense of myself so that I can function more easily, right? If I have a real chameleonic, a really porous kind of sense of identity or integrity, that's got its issues. And all of these things show up in stories if we are listening and trained to listen. Yeah. Another breath, another paragraph. I'm going to take a sip of water just to slow myself down. I don't think I'm accelerated, but who knows? So just to say, to act is a very complex business. Acting is complicated. Just even doing a simple gesture like this, if you reverse engineer it, it's amazing, right? In terms of all the motor control, right? All the different little muscles that have to be activated simultaneously in both hands and my arm, in order just to do a simple movement like this. And of course, that tracks back into my nervous system, the intention in my cortex, the intention of a communicative process, and then, how the motor cortex, all of this has to do a massive amount of coordinating just so that I can do a little gesture like this, And then, of course, my heart has to support it and my metabolism has to support it. So the simplest action is biologically, physiologically amazing in its complexity. And when we dive into our deeper stories, and into all of that deeper material in us, the gestures and the actions, have all of that coloration and all of that information. So part of what we're looking at is really saying, wow, look at the amazing amount of information that emerges as I try to enact my story. Oh, my partner left me. Okay, well, sure, we understand on one level what this gesture is, but there's a lot of layering of information in that gesture, which is both a public statement, but it's also a very personal statement. And anyway, so part of what we're, intention is when we listen to stories, we're really looking at the enactment of it. And the whole show that we're talking about, the enactment, the feelings, the emotions, the content, the response to life, develops what we call the somatic, the somatic configuration, right? So the somatic configuration is really everything that presents itself in the moment and in relationship to the story. Yeah. So if it's a story of joy, look at the whole somatic configuration will resonate with that quality and will project it. And it'll project it not just outside, but it'll project it back to me. Yeah. So it's always got a double face. It's like out and in. And what we find is we're often not listening to ourselves. We're so intent on getting the message out somehow that we don't take our own feedback back in. And it sounds simple, but when we do that, it is quite amazing the information we are communicating to ourselves. And this is something that has to be experienced to see how radical it can be. Yeah. So we look at the shape of the story, the whole shape, the whole configuration. Yeah. And it's not just about, a little body reading here and a little motor, action here and, and adding, this and that. there's a wholeness to any action, even if it's an action of suffering. There is a wholeness to it. It may not exactly be serving us, but it's a whole configuration. And so so that's a lot of what we focus on, and the gestures and the postures and the rhythms are a whole world that we're interested in exploring and unpacking. Yeah. So that's a big piece. I'm going to give you a moment to either go to sleep or integrate it or resonate with it or whatever, right? Okay, so I guess we should move to, this is kind of a set of a little bit of context for story listening and storytelling. And so our kind of primary listening mode is using these 5 steps, this bodying practice, because in telling our stories, part of what's underlying the story is an attempt to embody. We may think we're trying to solve a problem. We may need, we're kind of trying to blame somebody for something. Who knows what we're trying to do with our stories. But at a certain level, the interest is to embody. Yeah, this formative embodiment. Yeah. And it's hard to embody if you've got really confused messages going on in you, and I think all of us appreciate that happens in moments or a lot or however, and so how badly we need ways to disentangle stories. And I'm sure many of you have many methodologies that work well for you. It's not about not appreciating that there are many intelligent and useful methodologies out there, but it's about adding another dialogue with stories, another way to listen, another set of somatic markers that can open another layer, another door, and sometimes surprisingly efficiently. So these 5 steps which Kellerman developed, I think are just amazing in that they are very isometric with the way the body works. Yeah. If you look at the formative process from conception on, the body is always changing shape, right? In the embryo, the shape changing is at a massive pace, right? How quickly it goes from 2 little cells, right, into a ball of cells, into a 2 germ layers, 3 germ layers, right? Differentiations, migrations, it's like the shape changing is massive. And so for every shape change, there is both a disassembling of something and a reassembling of something. Yeah. So that in our formative beginnings, there is a whole template of where we're going, right? We don't know where that template sits, because for everything that people know about embryology, they don't quite know where all of this incredible intelligence, formative intelligence lies. They know some things about it. At any rate, we can appreciate it, right? That forming ourselves is an internal inherited process of assembling, disassembling, reorganizing, lengthening, expanding, compressing, just the whole world of embryological formative shapes. And it keeps going even into babyhood, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. I have to admit to my, I don't look anything like I looked when I was a baby or an adolescent or even as a young adult. I have to admit, for all the push-ups and sit-ups and yoga that I've done, my shape has continued to change, not as quickly as it did, in uterus, but we are changing our shapes constantly, and we can try to maintain ourselves as well as possible. And yet the shapes will change. There will be a slower but constant disassembling, reassembling into ever more maturing shapes, And if we work with that process, we maximize the possibilities. If we fight the process, we have problems, So we really want to support this formative process. And Kellerman has, really a beautiful model as how formativeness continues, not just through our powerful alpha adult, but into our maturing phases. And as we approach the final phase, these are all, it is part of a single formative process that we can appreciate. It's not just a losing and a diminishing, but it's a continual forming into the next big space that we occupy. And so this is kind of the 5-step process. First, we recognize, where am I in this moment, right? What's my shape right now? In my story, in my moment. And we bring it into relief, right? We give it the momentary shape that it has, and we let it start to speak to us, right? Critical part is we're listening to our own voices instead of either discounting them or jumping here or jumping there or interpreting them and then thinking we have the whole story. We're listening to our story in a very particular way. So when I interrupt my moving around and in kind of freeze frame, an important gesture that initiates a feedback loop from the motor, that slow time begins to give information to my brain and my nervous system, right? Because if I'm always changing shape, my nervous system is trying to keep up with what I'm doing. And when I slow it down and pause, immediately something different starts to happen. And then the 5-step process is then what I can do is I can intensify it, right? So first I notice, name it, experience it. Second, in small steps, I intensify it and listen to those steps. And, the problem with a lot of behavior is I can talk about it forever, and talking about it and having insight to it, as we all probably know, doesn't necessarily change it. It's not enough critical information. I have to know how I have created my states, how I have created my behavior. If you don't know how you've done it, how are you going to undo it? And the motor part of this gives me a beautiful way to begin to appreciate, this is how I've created this compressed space in myself. I'm not just fighting against my compression. I see actually by intensifying it, whoa, I see how I've done it and how uncomfortable it is. And now I can begin to disassemble. Oh, that's how I do it. But I may discover all kinds of things in this process. I may discover that, I used to think, wow, I just want to get rid of this. Wow, release it, throw it to the winds, be free. But often as we do it this way, I find, I've organized my shapes for a reason. I haven't just organized them randomly. I've organized them for survival and for other needs. And when I begin to organize and disorganize them, I discover many things about myself, which are not about throwing anything away or just, I go, look at this. This was an intelligent thing to do at that moment in my life, in that situation. So anyway, this is the very simple view of the promise of this method. Now, we thought maybe I could give you a demo in working with somebody also, but it'll be really short, really contained. And then we'll have them, so it'd probably have to be about at max 10-minute process, but maybe, it'll give you a little bit more of an image of the, the possibilities of this work. So I think Kate is Brett still standing by?
Yeah. Brett, are you ready?
Ready, set.
I'm ready.
We're not. I just have to find you.
Yeah, I thought I put you up there. Here, let me just.
Great. There you are. Okay, Brett. Hello. Okay. Well, I appreciate your offering your somatic configuration to us, And are you able to drop your screen down just a little bit so that I can see more of your whole corpus? That's good. Or whoops, it just went back up. Okay, great. So we're going to do a very simple, it's not going to be a really extended session. But what I'd like to invite you to do is to, if, to the extent that you're willing to, talk about something maybe something moderately important, maybe difficult, maybe challenging, and just begin to tell us a little bit the story of this, this difficulty or this challenge. Okay, and then I'll kind of step in.
Great. Yeah, I have one on tap. That's perfect.
Okay.
So the challenge for me a lot of times is when you were talking about someone who's a bit of a chameleon. Who are you, or how well do you know yourself? Are you solid, or are you sort of a chameleon who does things? I have traditionally fit into the more of the chameleon, please everybody, want to be liked by everybody category.
Okay, good.
So my story, it's a very, very specific one. Is there's someone in our neighborhood who's just a horrendous human being, very socially, one-on-one, probably a very nice person, but socially he's just horrible. And I know it, and I don't like that part of him. And yet, so we are walking our dogs. He has a couple dogs like ours. So we're walking our dogs. We're going along the sidewalk, and his dog goes across the street and does its business and comes right back. And as we're passing, I'm saying, like, Cody, now why can't you be like his dog? And Kate, who is with me, was very alert and says, afterwards, why did you say that? You don't like that person. And it was a great question, and it started a lot of thought processes in my head. Why did I say that? Why would I care whether he sees me in any light whatsoever? Because I really don't want to have anything to do with him. I don't need his attention, approval, anything from him. So that was the start. Yeah.
So you're saying that is an example of your being a chameleon?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, so we've had two phases here in Brett's story. The first phase where he talked about, just the process of chameleon, and then he went into a specific event. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, because when Brett was talking about chameleons, he made a gesture. He may not even have been aware of this, you see, because, this whole motor dimension, we don't pay attention to it. We're paying attention to all kinds of things. And when he said chameleon, he did this, right? Now, I was almost going to stop him, but it seemed like he was going further into the story, and there might have been more, but so this gesture is part of how Brett understands chameleon, right? And so why don't we go back there, even though you don't remember, but I was kind of keeping track. And why don't we be a chameleon again, motorically?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
that way.
there you go. Interesting. Okay, so see, we have a little bit of a lexicon here. We have this, and all of a sudden, right, this happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's stay with the motor. So let's stay with your being a chameleon. Okay, so we go to the right, we go to the left. Okay, and stop right there. Now, it'd be nice if we could see that a little bit better, but that's okay. So stop right there. And just take that in. Ooh, whoa, see, not easy to hold it. Something happened, huh? What's going on for you as you sit with this?
Well, I'm looking at it.
You're
I'm suddenly observing, and I'm watching which direction and I'm noticing that my palms are the things facing outwards.
Interesting, right? So there's there's
It's
a
not
dance.
like this, it's
Look at
that.
that. Whoa. So we're seeing some of the shapes of your chameleon. You see, the chameleon can do this, it can do this and this, it can do, your chameleon is quite a chameleon. We've seen 3 or 4 different shapes as Brett is talking about. Yeah, right. What just happened there, Brett? Yeah, looked like,
Just taking that in.
yeah,
And wanting to settle, recenter, because all this going back and forth has gotten me to want to be just a little bit more
exactly.
hands on the legs, hold myself.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
See, so experiencing your own chameleonness, right, in a very present physical way, evoked your desire for something different, more stable. See, so one thing is to have the idea, another is to really experience something, right? Good. And so just let yourself experience your hands on your legs, like you said, something a little bit more stable. Ooh, and what is that like for you?
Much better. Much
better. Wow. Okay, see that? So now here you have a kind of a very physical, alternative to something you do regularly, right? I see. And so now we have a dialogue between 2 parts of Brett, a much clearer dialogue and shape of his chameleon, but also the shape of something more steady and stable. Yeah, nice. So that's a really nice, I think, first step. I think people can kind of see that, we could, of course, continue and take it further, but in this, we don't have really the time. But I thought that was a very nice kind of, I appreciate, your participating. And this is what tends to happen. We begin to get information about how we're doing things, somatic information, and actually how we're forming a behavior. So, we may know we're chameleon, but we can't get a grip on it really in a way. We can think about it, we can image it, we can talk about it. But this gave a very kind of clear shape to it. And in clarifying that shape, the alternative also took a clear shape. And look at how you see what steadiness and stability feels like. So it's the whole somatic configuration. Great. Very nice. Okay. That feel okay, Brett? Great. Thank you. All right. See, so simple in a way. Yeah. And so the idea here, this is available to us, right? And but as happened with Brett, happens to 95% of people. This whole enactment layer of their stories, somehow they don't pay much attention to it. You know, we do know there are therapies that do pay some attention to motor and movement and gesture. But what I've found is that few of them, you know, and that's all very useful, but Kellerman has a very particular way of, you know, taking a moment. So let's say I'm angry, right? You know, and when I'm angry, I'm angry. And often with a powerful emotional response, I don't have much nuance to it. I'm just pissed, you know, and that pissness is driving me, and it, you know, it's creating whatever it's creating in the environment. You know, I might start yelling at somebody, I may turn it inward, and you know. And this exercise begins to first, I can really see what I've just organized in terms of anger. Right? I get information about the state. If I intensify it a bit, I get clearer about my own anger. I get information about my own anger and what it's costing me. Whoa, I don't like this, actually. And then as I soften it, I begin to see some possible alternatives. You know, it's not about getting rid of the, you know, maybe I was angry for a good reason. It's not about just getting rid of the anger, but it's about being able to manage it in ways that may be less costly and actually more effective on a social, you know, in a social frame. So this is the way that this exercise works with our deep physiology, our deep organization, our motor cortical conversations, and begins to give us ways, very constructive ways, to be in the world and be with ourselves. And, you know, this, you know, when you start to explore the possibilities of this, they get really interesting. So this is a bit of the idea behind the three levels of storytelling, right? And I think what you've also seen, the critical part is, it really is about our own information gathering of what's going on in ourselves and our shaping that information, right? There's a social dimension, you know, the other person is there, is listening, but I'm not leading the show. I'm not giving them advice. I'm not trying to intervene to make it okay. It's, you know, Kellerman emphasizes the self-education of the process. So it's actually quite empowering because, you know, I mean, you know, Brett noticed his own chameleon and he found his own stability, right? And so my job was to support that in him. So it's a very, you know, particular kind of work. So anyway, I think hopefully that gives you in an hour a bit of a overview of what this process and this formative work is and how storytelling can fit into that as an important part of it. So good. I mean, I don't know if we have a couple minutes for questions, any burning questions. I guess we have another 5 minutes or so.
Yes,
then-
we have 5 minutes. Would anyone like to come up and interact with Jim and have a question? Just open your microphone and I'll bring you up. Alia asks about a book, specific book.
Well, a nice book, he wrote it early in his career, but I think it really is a very nice book, is Somatic Reality. He wrote it in the 70s, but I believe, and but it really has held up very well, and it's very readable. It's a nice entry level. He has quite a few books which are rich in content, but they are a challenge at first to read. But so there's a whole range of books. But I think Somatic Reality, Living You're Dying. Some of those early books are quite accessible, even though they don't necessarily have his later life process and procedures. They really were his early big bang into what he later did. So I think that's a good place to start. Somatic Reality or Living You're Dying.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question that they'd like to come and interact with Jim? So there's a question to me, is the third part of the story in the demo, and Brett noticed his desire for more stability, the empowerment phase?
Yeah, well, of course, there's an element of empowerment, right? I mean, in Chameleon, the chameleon structure kind of, it's a structure that kind of gives power away a bit. Oops, I have to adapt to the other. For me to fit in, I need to model the other. It's a very other-based and it can be very convenient. Chameleonness can be very useful in many situations. It's a flexibility and adaptability. But as a personal style, it's got its problems because you never consolidate and find a stability in yourself. And I think it is empowering, to find that stability and that statement that says, I'm right here. And, I can shift when I want to, but I can also be stable and be here. And I think that is empowering. Yeah.
So Kirsten, would you like to come up and?
Thanks. Great to be with you again, Jim. And I was just wondering, speaking from a chiropractic point of view, just working with this, and it kind of relates to the question that John has put on the chat, working with physical manifestations of things like chronic pain issues where.
Right. Well, we use it for all kinds of things. And sure, I mean, if there's deep internal compression and deep reactivity and, conflictual issues from early life for whenever, that's obviously going to affect our physiology, our behavior, at a level that, we're going to try to function, and we can be very high functioning, and yet the body is having to manage and carry that with it. And it can lead to a lot of, energy drain and efforting and physical pain and discomfort. So the work can really, it's still an educational work. It's about how you are with yourself. But as you could see, you start to decompress, you start to have a dialogue with yourself, and that has big physiological and musculoskeletal implications. So it can be a great help there.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to hear you say that. I knew that already, Jim, but I just wanted to.
Glad to reinforce that. Okay. Great. Sure. Great.
Thank you.
Good. Maybe another question or two.
Edwin, do you want to come up and ask your question? I'm happy to pull you up on the screen with.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, will you open your microphone for me? I'll find you. There you are.
Okay, Edwin, hello.
Can you say more on context and storytelling?
Context, yeah. Well, that's kind of a, depending on what you mean by context. But of course, I mean, context is almost everything, So the stories, any story will have a context. And so in the work itself, we've just taken a step into it. But of course, a context will realign the story. The right context will be a larger frame within which a story can reorient itself, And so, yeah, sometimes we are engaged in inner conversations and we aren't really in relation to the context that's holding it. I mean, I'm answering you in a general way, but sure, context can be critical in any one moment. Now, sometimes it's not so critical. It evolves out of the work itself, and the right context is kind of discovered or forms as a person does its work. At other times, it's useful to offer a context and see if it's useful. I don't know if I can kind of, given our time and given what you may have in mind when you say that.
Well, I just really noticed in the example with Brett, how he was able to shift his context about his being a chameleon.
Absolutely. That's what I was saying. It kind of, your context will shift as you disorganize something. There's a natural shift in orientation and context. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Jim.
Great. Sure. I guess we at most have time for one more question at most, and then I think it's a quick.
Okay.
We're stretching.
Susan, Sarah Martin, would you like to come up and ask a question? Are you still here? Nope.
Hello, I
Okay.
am here. I just have a cold today, so
Oh, you're not on video.
no, that was intentional as well. I'm not in a good space for that.
Okay, but you can ask your question.
Yes, I was curious. Is part of the process to create more intensity, to bring this attention to the movement, and in that it creates an energetic quality of just bringing integration then to that process. Am I getting that right?
Well, in a way, I mean, sure, by intensifying it, you bring more energy to it, because there's more arousal, more energy dedicated to it, but that also brings clarity to the form. Yeah. And it amplifies the experience of it, right? So you get more information about what happens when you organize that way. And then when you begin to disorganize it, well, there's a natural shifting of, there's maybe less efforting. And in that less efforting, you have a bit of a different sense of yourself, right? And, and there can actually be an expansion from that. Yeah. And so there are a lot of, these kinds of physiological and felt sense dimensions, but, you're always working with your own vitality. This is, your behavior is a reflection of how you shape your excitement, how you shape your arousal, how you shape your vitality. Yeah. And, some people really compress their vitality and some people let it dissipate. And what we're looking for are forms that are elastic, adaptable, but they have enough containment, but also enough, adaptability and motility. So I don't know if that is an exact response to your question, but.
Yeah, it just seems that calling attention to the movement helps reflect, I suppose, what is already being told by that individual, but it helps to reflect so that they can actually see their own story.
Exactly. I mean, that's right. They get to hear more. They get to hear their own voices with more clarity. Yep. And
Thank
their
you
own.
for saying more about that.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, for listening. We'll be sending out the recording to everybody who attended and who registered, along with information about Jim's offerings. We're having a course coming up at the end of September. It's called Endings, Transitions, and Beginnings, and how we manage our major life transitions. So I hope to have you learn a little bit more about Jim. There'll be other information I'll send you, or come to his upcoming offering. And we'd like to see you again next time here at Pre and Perinatal Healing Online. Oh,
Good.
look, Dominique's doing a little
All
Oh,
right.
that was pretty good, Dominique.
All right. Good. Well, I really appreciate everybody showing up here. There's a million things we could be doing, and appreciate having you here. And anyway, I think, yeah, as you can tell, I really love this work. I think it's incredibly valuable, useful, and you are invited to this course in September. It'll be my first trip to the US in over 3 years. So I'm looking forward to it. And I certainly appreciate Kate supporting it. So anyway, good. So
All right, see you next time, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
thanks a lot. Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Nikolai.